CEO of Netflix, and here are 5 lessons I've learned over the last 20 years of Netflix.
Now, in 2000, Netflix was very different than the company you might know today. We were very small. We were about 2.5 years old. We had less than 100 employees. Nobody knows anything. True in Hollywood, and I believe true almost any place people are trying new ideas. I mentioned before,
entrepreneur, investor, mentor, and co-founder of Netflix. Here's my advice on helping your small business stand strong.
Back in 1997, 2 entrepreneurs made a bet that almost nobody believed in. Reed Hastings and Marc Randolph launched Netflix at possibly the worst time imaginable. The technology they needed didn't exist yet. The market wasn't ready, and they'd faced near bankruptcy before anyone even knew their name.
a strategic alternative was Blockbuster. But in 2000, they were on a very different trajectory. So we were on track to do $3 million. Blockbuster was on track to do $6 billion.
When Netflix went live in April 1998, DVD players cost $700. That's over $1,200 in today's money for a single device. Most American households didn't own one and had no plans to buy one. The founders were asking people to rent movies in a format they couldn't even watch. It was like selling smartphone apps before smartphones existed. The early operation was chaotic. Executives weren't shopping at wholesalers for inventory. They were literally going to Walmart and Costco, buying DVDs at full retail price, then renting them out at a loss. One early employee described the process as shoveling coal through the side door of a house. There was no glamorous Silicon Valley startup here, just desperation masked as innovation. The original website looked nothing like what we know today. Purple color scheme, clunky interface, and a pay-per-rental model that charged $4 per DVD for 7 days. Returns cost extra. New releases cost even more. The supposed convenience of mail order was offset by waiting 2 to 3 days for movies to arrive. Blockbuster could give you a movie tonight. Netflix needed you to plan your weekend viewing 3 days in advance. By the year 2000, the company was hemorrhaging money. They burned through over $50 million and were nowhere near profitability. Subscriber count crawled toward 300,000, a number that sounds impressive until you realize Blockbuster served millions of customers weekly. The dot-com bubble was bursting around them. Companies were collapsing overnight. Netflix had planned to go public and raise desperately needed capital, but the market crashed and those plans evaporated. Facing potential bankruptcy, Hastings and Randolph did something that became legend for all the wrong reasons. They approached Blockbuster, the giant they supposedly wanted to overthrow, and offered to sell Netflix for $50 million. The pitch was simple. Blockbuster would run the stores, Netflix would handle the online operation. It was basically a surrender, dressed up as a partnership proposal. Blockbuster executives laughed them out of the room. Not metaphorically. Former Netflix CFO Barry McCarthy later confirmed they were actually laughed at during that Dallas meeting. Blockbuster saw no threat from this struggling DVD mail service. Why would the king of entertainment rentals partner with a company most people had never heard of? What most people don't know is that Blockbuster wasn't the only company that rejected Netflix. In 1990, Amazon offered to buy the company for somewhere between $14 and $16 million. Jeff Bezos invited the founders to Amazon's chaotic headquarters, where employees worked in makeshift spaces and dogs ran through the offices. Bezos saw potential in Netflix, but Hastings and Randolph ultimately said no. They'd just started. Selling felt like giving up. That decision nearly destroyed them. Throughout 1990 and into 2000, Netflix was a company on life support. They'd bet everything on a format most consumers didn't own hardware for. Their business model of charging per rental wasn't working. Customer acquisition costs were astronomical. Each new subscriber cost more to obtain than they generated in revenue. The only thing that saved Netflix was a radical pivot in September 1990. They introduced the subscription model, unlimited rentals for a flat monthly fee. No due dates, no late fees. It was the opposite of everything Blockbuster represented. But even this innovation wasn't enough to stop the bleeding. The company was still losing money at an alarming rate. Behind the scenes, there was turmoil. Marc Randolph, who'd been CEO since founding, was pushed aside in late 1990. Reed Hastings took over as CEO just before everything got worse. The dot-com crash hit in 2000, and suddenly investor money dried up completely. Netflix couldn't go public. They couldn't raise additional funding. They were trapped in a business that required massive capital investment, with no clear path to profitability. The company secretly engaged in practices that would be controversial if widely known. They deliberately slowed DVD deliveries to heavy users, people they internally called pigs. If you rented too many movies under the unlimited plan, Netflix would throttle your service. The warehouse would mysteriously take longer to process your returns. Your next disc would ship slower. This wasn't a bug. It was intentional cost control, because the business model only worked if people didn't actually use it as advertised. Throughout the early 2000s, Netflix faced another fundamental problem nobody talks about. They had almost no leverage with Hollywood studios. Getting DVDs in bulk at reasonable prices required relationships and credibility Netflix didn't have. Ted Sarandos, hired in 2000 to handle content, spent his first 3 years working from his bedroom in Los Angeles because the company couldn't afford proper office space outside their Silicon Valley headquarters. He had to use personal relationships from his previous job to convince studios to even take meetings. The first few years were a masterclass in survival, not success. Netflix didn't post its first profit until 2003, 6 years after founding. That profit was just $6.5 million on revenues of $272 million. For context, Blockbuster was generating billions in revenue during this same period. What kept Netflix alive wasn't brilliant strategy, it was timing and luck. DVD player prices finally dropped. By late 2001, they'd become popular holiday gifts. Suddenly, the market Netflix had bet on actually existed. Subscribers started growing rapidly, not because Netflix had figured something out, but because the technology they'd gambled on finally reached mainstream adoption. Even then, success was fragile. In 2004, Blockbuster finally responded with its own DVD by mail service called Total Access. Customers could rent online and return discs in stores for immediate exchanges. It was everything Netflix offered, plus the convenience of physical locations. Blockbuster signed up 2 million subscribers in the first year, a quarter of Netflix's entire customer base. For a moment, it looked like the giant had woken up and would crush the upstart after all. Netflix survived that challenge, not through superior service, but because Blockbuster's business model was unsustainable. Total Access lost $2 on every disc rented, after factoring in shipping and store costs. Blockbuster was bleeding money trying to compete, while also supporting thousands of physical locations. They were carrying $1 billion in debt from a corporate spin-off. The company that rejected Netflix for $50 million eventually filed for bankruptcy in 2010. The dark irony is that Netflix almost failed multiple times during those early years. They were nearly sold to Amazon. They were rejected by Blockbuster. They burned through millions with no clear path to profitability. They engaged in questionable practices to control costs. The company that would eventually revolutionize entertainment spent its first half-decade barely surviving. When Netflix finally went public in 2002, shares opened at $15. The company had 600,000 subscribers and was still figuring out how to make money consistently. The early investors who believed in Netflix weren't visionaries. They were gamblers who got lucky because DVD players became affordable and Blockbuster made catastrophic strategic mistakes. This is the Netflix origin story nobody tells. Not the tale of disruption and innovation, but the reality of a struggling startup that bet everything on technology consumers didn't own, lost money for years, almost sold itself twice, and survived more through competitor failure than its own success. The streaming giant we know today was built on a foundation of desperation, rejected buyout offers, and the sheer stubborn refusal to quit when every rational indicator said they should.